Hello, my name is Grant Gustafson, Vice President, and one of the founders back in 1997. With this event, I think we put together well over 100 talks since then. Our purpose is to bring new voices to town, to be a design catalyst, and we usually hold our events downtown, and are appreciative to the Frye Art Museum for helping host the evening. The galleries are open here until they close at 8 o'clock, once we finish, by the way. And I really want to thank the Frye for making this possible. It was challenging to find a venue tonight. And so it's very good to be back. We've had 3 talks here, at least 3 talks here in the past. Our group, Space City, is 100% volunteer. It's been that way all these years, no paid staff. We're really happy to have about 14 regular volunteers from the ranks of architecture, design, graphic design, planning. So thank you, volunteers. Thank you to our 2025 donors. That would be Dalbuilt, Gates Foundation, Greg Bishop Architecture, and Shed Architecture and Design. And that's along with Magnuson Klemensic, Smart Ventures, who gave us a grant, and Scott Mitchell Studio. We have in-kind partners, LMN, The Shop, Peter Miller, Design Books and Supplies, and Pentagram, who designs our terrific posters pro bono every time. So thanks to all of our sponsors and to you who support us by coming tonight and attending other events. We'd love to receive year-end donations to support our 2026 salons, author talks, lectures, and happy hours. I think we're very clever how we kind of leverage what we have to take advantage of opportunities, people coming through the city. So please help us if you can. And speaking of an upcoming event, I'm going to give it back to Julia. She's going to talk briefly about our next event and introduce the speaker.
Yes, so this is our second to last event of the year, the last keynote. To end the year, we're going to do our annual holiday party, and that will be at the Pioneer Square Art Walk in December, on Thursday, December 4th at LMN's The Shop downtown. Hopefully we'll see you there. It'll be pretty fun. And then we do have some really exciting stuff planned for next year, but we haven't announced it yet, so stay tuned. We're very excited to have Mr. Tehrani here to speak. It's a very unique lecture title and description that seems very relevant for this time. It's a subject of great interest to me and many of us, especially in Seattle, where technology is sort of at war with culture and art. So I'm really looking forward to hearing what Mr. Tehrani has to say. And yeah, thank you for being here. Please join me in welcoming Nader Tehrani.
It's a great honor to be here. First of all, I should just say that it's going to be a little bit long because it's unedited. I'm just polishing a new lecture, and normally I would be talking about architecture, but in this instance, at this precarious moment, I'm taking a step back to what I did in graduate school in urbanism, to revisit the question of public space, in part because of the importance of reckoning with why is it that we do architecture in the first place. And if it is not in some service to a public domain, and what constitutes a more important mission than object building, as it were, how to define some of the obstacles and the challenges that we all face together. So, broadly speaking, there are some themes that guide the different chapters of the talk tonight, of form and formlessness. Form being architecture itself. Formlessness is that thing that does not abide by our intentions. The public really doesn't care. They will do with our objects whatever they want to do, as they should. Civic infrastructures has to do with, that other realm which is often not designed, highways, bridges, those other areas, liminal usually, but that have and could be part of the civic realm. Privatization is not a new thing, though it's become normalized, especially in the United States. Some years ago when I arrived here, I never imagined that the people of America would take Reagan seriously, but they did. And they voted him in. And since then, the incremental evolution towards the privatization of everything has become the de facto norm. And then, the debate between top-down and bottom-up formations of governance, which, of course, we're all going through today. I come to public space with, almost the conventional pedagogies, usually Western, from the Renaissance onwards through modernism. But my own background, as is evident in the central slide, is from Iran. Not a popular name in the US right now, and hasn't been over the last 40, 50 years, but has its own tradition, particularly in Isfahan, of the Grand Square. But despite the various orientations of these canons, if you will, whether Eastern or Western, what defines these spaces aptly is their form, meaning that they are formal in their description. And the reason I put Tokyo in there is because it's, places like Shinjuku and other places are, dense with people, thriving with an urbanism that goes up 6 stories and is defined essentially by formlessness. And I think that is a critical part of what we do as architects, let's say, mediating between form and the way in which spaces are appropriated to become other things. This is, of course, the Great Plaza in Isfahan, and it's important to recognize that, it is a place of picnic, it is a place of protest against the government, and of course, it's a place of worship also. So it has seen, in its own way, great changes. I don't know if any of you are up on Iranian politics these days, but since the bombings, there's also the mullahs have decided to withdraw the restrictions on the hijab, meaning the headscarves and all of that. So people are actually playing music in public and taking their chadors off. So there's an interesting evolution that's happening. But the relationship of form and formlessness is an important one because the majority of the world, this happens to be Caracas over there to the left, but Rio has seen this, and the formlessness of informal settlements is very much part of an organic way in which communities have evolved over centuries, architecture without architects, if you wish, that has also, in some ways, inspired great pieces of architecture. I don't know if many of you have visited Habitat. It is actually pretty extraordinary as a piece of architecture, and yet, of course, it's, ostensibly housing for the opulent. They're expensive, they are extraordinary, but it's a great piece of invention, and yet it doesn't inspire the kind of bottom-up regulatory mediations and negotiations that happen between neighbors that inspire a kind of public agency, if you will. I'm not considering the condo association as part of that discussion. not really a public square, or it's really a traffic roundabout. Some of you may recognize it. This will make it a little bit more recognizable. Tahrir Square, just some years ago, at the cusp of a significant revolution, and of course it takes on a different life at night. We had our own version of that, maybe far more symbolic, because the Shahryar Monument in Tehran was really the gateway to the city. Mehrabad Airport was just to the west of this, and the city you can see in the skyline beyond. And so this gateway is what brought you there. And really, it's also just a roundabout. It's not a public space, but I'm working that into the narrative because we inherited such a site at the Daniels faculty, a dangerous roundabout within which there was located Knox College, which was just to the south of the addition we made that then connects onto Lake Ontario. Knox College is a neo-Gothic structure with, pavilions at each corner, a corridor that wraps around a courtyard, with a lot of detritus in the back that we had to get rid of in order to develop a kind of urbanism that draws from the structure of the type, extending it around, refurbishing it with a northern face, what the project never had, what the Spadina Crescent never had, an infrastructure of cores, and then finally making the courtyard, the prior courtyard, into a flexible space that could have lectures like this, but also a lot of other events. Those of you who know Toronto also know that, the Crescent is one of three pretty extraordinary spaces. And Knox College has seen many lives and programs with a spire that everyone wished to remain visible. And so they desired an intervention that lay low, if only to become part of the landscape and even grow into, under, and through the landscape, activating the urbanism around the edges of the site and slowing the traffic, and then allowing for the landscape to receive additions in the future, which it has one, but not some of the other ones which have been animated here, maintaining the primacy of the spire to the south, with the northern glazing is essentially serving as a kind of skylight for the studio spaces pointing north. Oddly, since the main facade is to the south and the north, the reality is that it works east-west. And we worked diligently with the pavilions in the landscape to mirror somehow the pavilions that are part of the morphology of the neo-Gothic structure, extending the east-west logic that connects the campus to the Kensington neighborhoods as a way of activating the urbanism of the site, but also recognizing that the symbolic importance of the north-south is just different than the urbanism that is on the east-west. And so creating a plaza on one side and a colonnade on the other, with an open street that is essentially open to the public 24/7, that pierces through the building. And despite the volumetric, platonic purity of the building, my claim is that this is a landscape building. It is a landscape building not only in the way that the wings grow out into the landscape, but that each of the terraces somehow have a direct relationship with plazas and public spaces that act as a civic threshold into the space. This is the one towards the campus, which will see the most traffic, the so-called inner street, which has, all of the lockers, the cafe, the auditorium, the library, the Fab Lab. And it is really dense and active with people on a daily basis, and at the core of which you get the view, a framed view of Spadina North, a view up into the studio spaces, and a view down into the Fab Lab, which acts as a kind of hinge because it opens up into an outdoor space as it does to the inner street looking up, where other constructions will happen. This is an important space also because, as COVID brought an end to all schools, as it were, in presence, they continued their lectures here in situ on the outer lawn using the facade of the building as a screen on which to project. Now, this is all happening before the Truth and Reconciliation process that Canada had, but that north face also becomes, if you like, a tablet, a canvas for a cultural transformation, which, let's just say, the US hasn't really come to terms with yet, but Canada has been much more actively probing and trying to develop a language around questions of indigeneity, which is the other public that is not recognized. We collaborated with Public Work, great landscape architecture firm, and the quadrants that we developed, not only for programming in a functional sense, but in a horticultural sense, became an important way of recognizing what the vocation of the north-south, east-west will do. And how, in fact, while we tend to see as architects a circle, a crescent, a roundabout, that all of these fragments, in fact, are quite asymmetrical, seemingly eccentric, but actually an index of the different ways in which programs filter out into the landscape and begin to animate what is ostensibly a very well-occupied periphery. And so bringing their horticultural expertise to the fore really changed the way that we were thinking about the building also. The building was also a great collaboration with the Daniels faculty themselves, not just architects, but also landscape architects, urbanists. The invention of the roof, not only as a folded space, but as a green space, was the result of the landscape department's grit lab, which uses the entire roof as a platform of speculation. So it's a public space for them that looks over Lake Ontario, but it's also a research space that looks over to the north and the south. So ostensibly, all of these spaces are given a different program. The drop-off on the west side, an amphitheater on the east side, the Fab Lab opening up to the north where the lectures were happening during the COVID era, and the connection on the west side, and of course the alumni terrace that overlooks the lake on the south, which is where a lot of the kind of meetings happened after the Truth and Reconciliation process that inspires a new identity for their entire curriculum, in fact. And so the whole question of indigeneity has made its way into the core curriculum. At the core of the building is this flexible space, the auditorium, which could have a different character. It's its own public space, an institutional public space, but one that the dean very much wanted to inspire by, let's say, the work of Agam, amongst other artists whose work with color could be transformative. This space is divisible by 3, so while on big lecture days it can be occupied fully by 600 people, it's also divisible into 3 for smaller classrooms for their undergraduate program. And when there's rock stars for lectures, it can leak out into the upper studio space, which is an oculus that brings natural light into the auditorium. This is one of those occasions. But on a normal day, it would look more like this because it's an extension of the studio space that looks out as a kind of prospect onto Spadina North. As we drew this, of course, for us, it was a natural. It was a public civic platform that gave the students an idea about the city. They could read the city from this space. And the notion was that as an integrative space, it was a didactic artifact. The idea that a ruled surface was a surface active structural system that blends in daylighting and the hydrology of the roof, extending the water to two edges that then save the water for cisterns to hydrate the landscape, became a kind of emblem about how to integrate architecture with landscape. No surprise to you, probably, it was, deemed unbuildable by the builders. And we had to explain to them that these kinds of structures have been built for, over 100 years by figures like Felix Candela. But they said, well, even then, it's $1 million over budget. So they said they gave a counterpoint to our proposal with nice round skylights on a flat roof. So we decided to build a metal version of it in our workshop in the basement of our office that essentially does a low resolution version of that as a kind of triangulated steel structure with a radiant panel that clads it. Now that's important actually because obviously the concrete holds the heating system as heat rises, but the cooling system would need to be on top of you because cool air descends. And so as a human being standing in the studio space, you're in a kind of ice cream sandwich, with the heat coming up or the cooling coming down. And sort of miraculously, we did save about $850,000, rendering it possible to be within the budget. Classically speaking, it is a kind of IIT kind of space, lifted, as it were, with a prospect, but much more voluptuous, Rubenesque, and sensuous than maybe even what Candela could do because of the massiveness that the volumes above take on. Now, these kinds of public spaces are, I'm going back to the idea of the circle. They are platonic spaces, and they can be interiors, they can be exteriors, from left to right. The Nickerson Green at RISD is a classic connection that we invented between the Brown campus and the RISD Woods-Gary exhibition spaces. The MIT Gate has a new threshold where we have this large awning, a canopy that I'll present later. The RISD Library is a civic interior defined by a historic room that is open to the public, and then a pop-up project for a biennale that we said it's a waste of resources and energy. Why not design something that will become part of the community? And so the arcade became a kind of piece of infrastructure for the rectangular plaza that is the market space on a weekly day. But the notion of the urban room is very much, has become part of the identity of Spadina Crescent, and of course, the space of protest, as we have seen in the last 2+ years. So going back almost 50 years, this is the version of Shahiyot Square that you had probably seen. For those of you old enough to have witnessed the revolution, the US hostages and all of that, this is the space in which that happened. Now, as important as this was symbolically, more interestingly to me, the revolution actually happened in the city, not outside of the city where the symbol was. These bridges, these prefabricated bridges, were brought to Iran in the mid-70s from a Belgian company, sometimes installed in less than 6 weeks over major trafficked intersections, relieving the city of the kind of congestion it had. And interestingly, those pieces of infrastructure conceived for cars became really the most significant platforms for demonstration and the revolution. That, in combination with the cassette was the kind of the analog of the internet today. That was the reproducibility of the cassette became the mechanism, the conduit through which the message of the Ayatollahs was somehow disseminated in 1978-79. And then somehow the infrastructure of a growing city, a rapidly growing city, it was, I don't know if it was like 8 million back then, now it's probably 20 million, had many buildings like that became essentially vertical stadia for the revolution to happen. A lot of our work goes back to our early research on infrastructures in graduate school, and the notion that with the amount of dollars that are put into highway systems and other infrastructures, how they're not more integrated with the civic life and the public life of our daily presence in the city. And we had one such opportunity in Melbourne to connect the center of the city to the Yarra River, where there's a beautiful park, as it were, creating a pedestrian bridge that connects it to the Australian Open. As you know, the Australian Open is packed with people for about 2 weeks of the year, and then essentially empty the rest of the year. So the bridge is then dedicated at one level to the park itself, and the underbelly that becomes a trellis for the experience of the bridge. That experience that you see, well, yes, it's important, and it's an important threshold into the stadium and framing the city on the other side, but really it's about how to transform that structure to become something else, something dematerialized, something unseen before, unprecedented. And we were exploring ways in which simple technologies like rebar may, through structural redundancy, collaborate with larger steel elements to exact the figure of the maximum moment in what otherwise would be called a bowstring truss, but allowing the belly of this to form the structure of this trellis that then wraps around and goes up to become the lighting, the railings, the guards, and essentially define a kind of ephemeral mesh that defines the line between the kind of the underworld of the landscape and the upper world of the skyline of the city in which this intervention occurs. But the idea that a piece of engineering takes on not only an iconic stance, but a real platform in which it participates with the architecture of the landscape and the architecture of the tennis open was a central part of our mission. And of course, this has found its way into different projects also. On the left side, you can see in Somerville Station, the extension of the Green Line in Boston. It's one of those stations where that doesn't occur on a street, so you don't know where it is. They needed a marker a tower effectively, that you would see from the street in order to know where the station is. And so we weren't designed as the architects, we were designed as artists to make that tower that is sort of an uncanny structural system that is a stacked card system that is held down in tension rather than just being held up in compression as that marker. In the next slide, the irony of the new town center in Austin, Texas, being occupied by an electrical power station, and how the public space is forced to the periphery. And again, not as architects, but as artists, we were hired to conceptualize the concrete fence and the landscape around it. And of course, the Tenderun Bridge, and here the gateway for the Vaporetto, a temporary CLT structure for the Venice Biennale. The idea of these pieces of infrastructure takes on a greater agency for MIT Site 4's project. I will not present the entire project, but suffice it to say that it's a large dormitory, multi-use space, and a gateway into the campus, into the East Campus, what used to be blocks and blocks of parking lots just 10 years ago. And so part of the mission of this project was to, even though the views of the Charles River for the dormitories would have been better, obviously, facing south, to rotate the bar, the slab, north-south, giving the students east-west views, but bringing light back onto the main street, which is on the north side of this. A public quad open to the campus and to the city on the south side, and a connection to what's called the Infinite Corridor, which is the main spine of MIT, to the lower left-hand side. The base of that building then serves as a kind of urban sponge, if you will. There is no backside to this building. There's entries to the dormitories, the auditorium, the food court, daycare. I could go on, but it's one of those bases that has to do many functions on all sides. In fact, even embedding all of the services underground through one entry, which is quite interesting because it had a true impact on the way that it was both conceived and built. I'll speak to that in a second. But suffice it to say that the gateway into the campus isn't a momentary threshold in the way that you would go through a portal or a door. It's one block deep. So in contrast with the classical idea of a portal, we needed something that was, over 150 yards long to capture that moment of that gateway. And this occurs at the moment, at the intersection of where the connection between Main Street happens, the quad, and where the red line in Kendall Square stops. So we were then commissioned to make the gateway, but it had to absorb the MBTA's stops. That is the escalator, the elevator, and the stairs that come up into the head houses from the bottom up. And so the project, in a way, is working bottom up and top down. The infrastructure that is connecting the site to Alewife on one side of Boston and Quincy on the other side of Boston are all coming into convergence here, coming up through the head houses. The canopy is something that is something larger than the sum of their parts and is defined by the datum of the base of all of the buildings and is a larger civic figure that shelters the project. So interestingly, because of the particular role our project had to play for the entire development, these are not just one building, but 7 buildings, the terrace, the quad that is just south of our building, right above my arm, had to serve as the staging ground for all of the construction of their buildings also. So that means that while our building was being framed up, one floor at a time was being dug underneath the ground, underneath a thickened slab for the garage below. So the building was being constructed below ground as it was being constructed up in order that the slab act as a kind of logistical hub for all of these things, all while negotiating with the head house of the gateway and the connection to the Red Line. So it's a very interesting and, let's say, complex piece of civic infrastructure with a kind of civic canopy that effectively mirrors the activity of public life as you come down from the underbelly of the Red Line and emerge onto the station. So the threshold from both sides, 2 plazas, the gateway, the deepened block, the larger circulation, the MIT Museum in the bottom, the orientation into the campus to the top, the figure of the canopy essentially capturing the infinite corridor, the cores as they separate, allowing for a more urbanistically diffused way of connecting the 2 buildings. And then as you go underground, you begin to understand, not in plan, but in section, the connection that it has with the subway system and how the promenade emerges from the ground up to these cores and head houses, all while the roof is kind of as a piece of urban acupuncture landing in different places strategically as it navigates the public terrace on which it is all positioned. This is 3 days after it's opened, us wondering how it's going to operate. We designed it with an intensive idea about the kind of detailing that we do, very tectonically motivated with hundreds of joints. Of course, that was completely silly because with the maritime industry that we have there, much like you have here, we could build it in 2 pieces, a combination of fiberglass, carbon fiber, and so forth. 2 identical halves were built in Maine, transported along the coast, up the Charles River, and then transported and installed into the site in less than 8 hours. A lot of boring standing, waiting around for it to happen, but there's a little bit of drama at that moment where, you know, the 25, 27 columns have to kind of connect with the 2 halves, designing just sufficient tolerances so that they can wiggle left and right, up and down, because once the columns are planted, they're not moving anywhere. So there are very subtle inflections in the organization of the columns that allow for that, and its orientation, of course, to the Charles River. All of this built off-site in Maine, as I said, and a kind of attenuated threshold that is reflective from the view from the south, looking up at the Moshe Safdie Hotel to the north. Now, going back to the question of privatization, I guess this is that moment of reckoning that almost everything in this country has become privatized. In other words, our notion of public responsibility, what we might have had in the 20th century, has all but eroded. What does the government do for us? Or what do we as people do to create a platform for civic responsibilities? Anybody who flies around now sees the amount of private planes that populate airports. The health system in this country is all but privatized. If you want clean water, you have to buy it. It's not expected that it's in your taps. You have to pay for your Wi-Fi because it's not considered as part of your public infrastructure. Interestingly, while there is a public military, a good portion of military activities are done by private militias, and those are the ones who sometimes do the dirty deeds, as it were. At any rate, education that used to be public, free in state universities, require pretty hefty tuition now. I forget who these are, but it's recent history. So these are the bikers who were part of the private militia who were distributing food in Gaza just a couple months ago. And so it gives you a kind of heart-stopping sense of the strange relationship between ideology and public service and the outcomes around the world today. And inverting privatization is not necessarily an option we have, at least in the sense that architecture, buildings can't do that for us. They can do something, but, let's say you and I can go into the streets and demonstrate. We can get arrested, of course. We can go out there and fight. We can resort to violence. But architecture doesn't do that. We can only do disciplinary things. There are spatial strategies, there are formal strategies, and there are material strategies. And understanding, let's say, what the agency of architecture is what's at stake, at least in this forum. That is not to abdicate your responsibilities at the voting booth, but it's also an understanding of what our discipline can do in face of such odds. And there are, of course, private spaces that are critical for the public life of cities. This is a private space in New York City. Dense as it is deemed as a kind of public space. And much like the institutional spaces of Harvard Yards, where they arrest people these days, it nonetheless is a platform for diversity, if you like, inclusion, and those kinds of things that still stand for something, or maybe stand for something more in this day and age. So the design of the Melbourne School of Design is an important one, not just because of its architecture, which I'll talk about, of course, but the way that it was conceived infrastructurally as a series of public domains around the building. It's a building, imagine a school of architecture that is at the heart of the campus. You couldn't find a more important site. And it's rare that a school of architecture will happen, in the main plaza next to the student union. But how to make that space speak to the Neo-Georgian organization of the campus at large, with all of its quads, its courts, a mat building that is so deep and wide that in fact an internal court, an atrium if you will, could extend that public space into the core of the building while activating all of its edges. And then out of that central space, making the design studio, which brings all of the disciplines together. I should say that the initial analysis we did of this building had the notion of the levitating design studio at the top of the building, which is much higher than the Daniels faculty. And it was value engineered in the first 4 weeks of the design process. So the strategy that we adopted was how to negotiate an added space, mitigating the net to gross relationship of the square footage of the circulatory ambulatories around the atrium to go from 5 feet to 11 feet, and then using the money of the FF&E to create the railings for that studio space, and then implanting different furnishings that give permanence to the studio space that is a vertical studio space, and then borrowing space depending on schedule into the exhibition spaces, classrooms, and all of that, that make for this vertical studio. You have at the exhibition at the bottom, collaborative studio spaces and the second floor, individual laptop spaces in the third floor, and then finally crit spaces at the top. The sum total of which produces a vertical building requiring a kind of understanding of public space, not on the horizontal plane as we think of the notion of the public domain, but these kinds of floating terraces that operate akin to the life of goats in trees. It's just a wonderful, I don't know if any of you like animals, but I have a special place for animals in my heart. And the goats are very, very clever beasts, and they're very nimble on their feet. Anyway, all of the studios are hot desks. So unlike the US where we own our desks, essentially, it's a very expensive educational model. They don't have that. But we got to house about 1,500 students there out of the 2,000 in a more efficient space, with the visiting critic studios having a home in that totemic artifact that is hung from the ceiling. It's an important piece of the design because effectively it speaks to another urban model that is an anecdote for this discussion. The Tempietto in Rome is a kind of miniature folly, an ideal artifact that is within this medieval courtyard that overlooks Rome from a prospect itself on the Gianicolo. But the relationship between object and fabric is very clear. One is architecture, the other one is just fabric. And then on the right-hand side, in fact, Gehry is no different. Gehry designs what we think of as Gehry in the zoomorphic figure that is the boardroom or the conference room in the center. And he has to develop his own fabric in order to make that estranged object read as defamiliar in the center. We draw from Kahn, actually, which is more interesting in my mind because there's a more clever and incisive relationship between the figure of the rotunda and the configuration of the structure of the building. The structure of the building in concrete drives itself around to create the figure of the concrete of the drum, within which, of course, there's the stair. In this instance, working in collaboration with John Wardle, they turned us on to, this narrative of D.H. Lawrence's Upside Down at the Bottom of the World, a narrative of the two of them, the wife and the husband, fighting with each other in what we thought was the most beautiful land, but they just hated it down there. But the notion that we would create an architecture that is working upside down. And there was an apt metaphor for Australia, and the notion that the most important civic structure within that space derives its structural logic from a two-way slab at the very top, which is the skylight. It is also the regulatory element for the hydrology of this building also. Massive LVLs, 10 feet deep plus, from which is suspended the 3 studio spaces, all in wood, anchored to the side of the circulation. You can enter each of them, but you're going from massive elements to basically veneers of plywood as it is suspended over the piano nobile of the studio space. So in fact, it's a kind of inverted rustication, if you will. The thick stuff is at the top, the thin stuff is at the bottom, and something that I do not believe photographs can capture is the awe of levity, that is the improbable nature of something volumetrically so massive that has no structure. It's just suspended like a chandelier. Now, what is interesting about this project is also that Australia has an incredibly advanced prefabrication culture. So a good portion of the concrete and the wood were done off-site, allowing the construction to go from 24 months to 18 months, which is radical in terms of the economies of this building, with all of the pieces of the coffering being delivered to the site at 4 or 5 in the morning and then delivered into such state. And this here, you get a palpable sense of the thickness and depth of occupying the structure at the top, and then the thinness and the levity of that same structure at the bottom as it serves as acoustic baffles over the atrium space above, and the notion of improbable levity that is communicated by a civic interior. Yes, it's an interior, but it is a public space with a capacity to do something very important for the institution. This space has turned out so successful that the architects are very upset. The people you see in this photograph, none of them are architects. They're occupied by the rest of the school. So somehow it's become a space. But my vision of it, of course, was something more like the school in Sao Paulo, where the notion of revolution was still a palpable idea. Again, when I talk about the public interior, it's like, that fascination that I still have today with Grand Central Station. If I'm going anywhere from uptown to downtown, I'll make up an excuse to create a promenade that goes through that space, because even today it remains awesome. And so to some degree, that's what we tried to create in the Multi-Faith Hall at Northeastern University, where, for the first time in history, they've created a space which is, let's say, it's a space of the senses that is neutral, in the sense that it has no iconographic bias towards Christianity or Islam or Buddhism or this or that, but the attributes are brought into the space from the antechambers for the actual rituals, but the space of prayer is defined through 3 domes and oculi that can give you different orientations and a sense of light that is given by the draped glass around it. RISD, the library there, which is a kind of public room for the city, and Adams Library, which we did recently. Again, going back to the MSD, this focus on urbanism and the connection between the inside and the outside is a very important one, with the environment there inviting a lot of capacity to penetrate the space virtually and literally as a promenade, as a function of its air conditioning, and the kind of visual connection one has between the urban street and the studio space above as one looks up towards the kind of awesomeness of the studio. And how the programs of the library, the Fab Lab, and other public programs, the exhibition space, all come around to create activities on the outside, much like I described effectively in the Daniels, in this case, much more organized. This is one of our collaborators from John Wardle's office. And the various connections it makes to the city, and even the loading docks being absorbed into the logic of the building, the Fab Lab leaking out into the plaza on the north side, and then finally coming to the concrete lawn, which is not all concrete, but is the main space around which the civic front of that building coalesces next to the student union. Again, the space of protest. The facade that faces the concrete lawn is the Joseph Reed facade, a present from a bank in downtown Melbourne some decades ago that was brought there as a kind of pedagogical instrument, a classical piece of architecture. It stood there as an excuse to effectively make a connection between the outside and the inside. It was all blocked up before we got there, but we got to essentially study the facade. We drew it, we measured it, we recognized that it required not only the recording of its apertures on the inside, but needed lateral bracing on the inside structure. Activating, not only through light, but through access, some of its doorways into the exhibition space, and then using the need for a larger lateral stability as a classroom that then is embedded in the vault that is overhead as part of the theater of that space. And this is the facade reactivated, opened up, and so forth. Okay, last chapter. Thank you for hanging in there with me. I think you're all familiar with the classic debate between Robert Moses and Jane Jacobs. And for the purpose of this argument, at least, it's not so much that I'm not going to take sides, but I'm going to fess up that it's hard not to like Moses's investment in form, the unapologetic investment in form and in architecture in the works that he inspired around the city. Now, it just so happened that he did a lot of other things that would have ruined the city, and this is why we appreciate the activism of Jane Jacobs in saving it from the kind of maniacal top-down interventions that would have essentially cut right through Bleecker Street and other places in downtown Manhattan. I like to think that it's the mediation between these two forces that are a critical part of what we may come to contend with as architects. And this is the more difficult part to argue. You know, the upper left image is an extraordinary one because it, you know, at least that's the image I had of America before I came here. It's an image of the civil rights movement where Martin Luther King gave the I Have a Dream speech. And it's this notion that individuals come together to stand for something that they want the country to believe in. But the key to that, in great part, has to do also with the anonymity you can enjoy as being in a public space. And that anonymity is exactly what you don't have anymore. Everybody down there is a known entity. You are recorded, you are tracked, you are photographed, you are identified, if not by cameras, then by your own phones. If the drones above you are not shooting bullets at you, they are still following you in great part. Eventually, that loss of anonymity is also the loss of a certain kind of freedom. So we're actually up against a very different notion of the public space. It is actually quite important and critical that I can see you, but I can't see the police. In other words, you don't have anonymity, but they do. So that the rules are also quite skewed in this condition. By the way, these are just observations, and I'm not sure what they mean for public space, but it means the ground rules are the same. This is not public space of the 20th century, where the way that technology is absorbed into this discussion, one way or another, is probably another chapter that has to be included in this. But I bring these last projects into this because they form a different part of our own practice that, let's say, is less about form, but also about cultural entanglements for which we don't necessarily have the right answers, but they're part of the research that we did. In collaboration with Van Allen, there has been a movement to close Rikers Island, which is the main penitentiary that everybody in the New York area, in the 5 boroughs of New York, goes to. If you kill somebody, you'll end up there. If you run a traffic light and somebody says you ran it because you were drunk, you may end up there. So it doesn't matter sometimes how bad a thing you did, but you'll end up there. The problem with it is not so much that, but once you're there, you're in the system. And so it may take them a week or maybe 3 weeks to get you in front of the judge. And during that, a kid who's 16 years old, has done nothing wrong, is already violated in that system, if not by the guards, then by the other inmates, and then starts a kind of cycle of devolution that is neither good for the individual, nor the public, nor the educational system, nor anything. So the part of the idea of this whole study was, what would happen if we undertook a community-based justice reform system whereby the community is motivating the whole process, getting rid of Rikers Island and then decentralizing justice hubs that go all around the city. So there isn't the idea of the project was not to create a forum, but rather the form really had to do with the thesis is in the decentralization of all of these into justice hubs around the city, involving family members, schooling systems, mental health specialists, people that help individuals get back into jobs, help victims as part of the process also. I mean, it's a complex process, but decentralizing it so it brings a human face to every part of the process in which they are involved. At the same time that we were involved in this, we were called by Lincoln Center. I'm sure many of you have been to the opera there, or to the symphony there. But really, this is, Lincoln Center is this extraordinary project that is the result of, it slips my mind right now. Somebody has to tell me, what did they do in the 60s? They did it in the West End of Boston also. They essentially raised the entire neighborhood in order to build this public institution. But so too, when they did that, they turned their back essentially on Amsterdam. This is Amsterdam here. And so that effectively means that it's a beautiful civic institution that faces Broadway, faces Central Park, and essentially turns its back on the disenfranchised community that they themselves produced on what used to be the San Juan Hill community, a thriving community with great musicians and great communities, to a housing project that would go essentially part of the NYCHA system, unprotected, uninvested in, and something that sits idle for decades and decades and essentially hits a brick wall, a travertine wall, actually. So part of our project was to create a new front on that western side, and there were ways of doing this, actually. And so part of it had to do with identifying institutions that are activating the site in the round, not only from the west, but also from the south and the northwest. Creating larger extensions between that and the river. Effectively, it meant having to overcome some of the obstacles on Damrosch Park. And part of it has to do with the realignment of what you conceptualize as your authorship. It's not that you're sitting there in your studio with your genius drawing away by yourself. It is a community process. It is absorbing other people's ideas. It is activating what they have in their minds as part of a larger theme. In this case, the threshold, and to create an accessible threshold that brings you into this domain was seen as a radical act, essentially, that brings you into this space. The activation of the plaza connections to the main campus is a central part of this, and the notion that this is a space for all and, makes out of a hill. I don't know how you do it in Seattle. How do you make Seattle accessible? There must be. Is there an accessible route in Seattle? There is, right? But I went up a very steep hill to get here, but I kept thinking, what if? Anyway, but putting the question of architecture aside for a moment, which there's a lot of here, we did the master plan. The reality is that the architecture right now, as we speak, is being done by Vice Manfredi. So it's not this scheme, but all of it has to do with, a notion of creating civic structures that bring you into the campus and invite a totally different connection with the community. Here, framing the West Side San Juan Hill community and imagining a different investment in the people, their music, their culture that will be part of the space. Right now, under construction, is our Met project, and that's an important one because the ancient what used to be called the Ancient Near East Collection is now called the Ancient West Asian Collection. There are colonial ramifications about this renaming, as you can imagine. But it's part of two wings. One is the Cypriot collection, and one is the Ancient West Asian collection. And ideologically, let's just say, these two cohorts are not in bed together. Why is that? Why? Because the Cypriots, let's say, are first of all, are collected by Cesnola. Cesnola was the original curator and the head of the Met, but also the person that made all of these, brought back all of these artifacts in, let's say, more dubious times about how procurement happened. But also, arguably, and we can dispute this, the Cypriot collection, the interesting part of the Cypriot collection is that all of the artifacts are mutts. They're hybrids from the Mediterranean. They are gaining influences from Egypt, from the Phoenicians, from the Romans, and from the Greeks. But in their eyes, of course, the major influence is from the classical canons. The ancient West Asians don't think like this at all. They want, in effect, to decolonize the museum. They have artifacts, but they want to repatriate some of those artifacts. They want to show how the collections were made in the first place. They want to set whatever artifacts they have within the cultural setting that shows the entanglements and the brutalities of colonization that gave birth to them, and in part showing the history of the materials that gave birth to those artifacts. Bronze wasn't just there, it was something that was mined, and the crafts that were born out of that were part of that. Anyway, the way that we got the job actually came from my reading of the Mediterranean by Fernand Braudel, and this notion that we have to look at other histories, not only at the victors of wars, not only from the perspectives of the kings and the queens, but from everyday lives, from trades that happen on the quotidian basis, from languages that are shared and disseminated, and from influences that are happening at the microscopic level. And part of that was to overcome also this notion of the polarity between the museum as a purported neutral space. By the way, I'm saying this in a deferential way. That's a beautiful museum by Pfeiffer, an equally beautiful Getty by Machado Silvetti. But in one case, the recreation of a classical antecedent as the context for those artifacts. In the other one, the neutralization of that. In our case, what the curators wanted was a notion of affect, where the materiality and the color of those collections come through, but not necessarily replicating the iconography or the literal context in which they were born. And so that finds its way into these collections in other ways that are very important. I thought this was the last one, but you know what? There's one more project, and I'm going to dash through this because it has to do with another aspect. All of these things are highfalutin cultural things, but this is the one that in some ways is my favorite because it involves football, American football. And we had done 3 schools of architecture, which is kind of unprecedented if you think about it. I think we have the record on that. I'm not sure, but it's accidental. When 2008 happened, we, like everybody, we had this crisis of what we're going to do. So we did 3 competitions, and believe it or not, we won all 3. And so we did Georgia Tech, MSD, and Daniels. Many years later, we were on the shortlist for the Nebraska College of Architecture, and we got it 2 weeks before a new dean came on. Well, deans are intelligent, right? The dean came in, saw that there was no budget for it, and canceled it right away. So then what happened was that they realized they couldn't live without a new edition. They couldn't operate without a new edition. So they opened up a new search and shortlisted 3 local firms to do the building. And one of those firms, HDR, did their homework. They said, oh my God, these guys had already won this project, and look at them. They have an expertise in this thing, and we don't. If we team up with them, maybe we get this project. And so I got a call from Tom Trenelone, wonderful guy. And, in 3 days, we put together a proposal, went into the interview, and before the end of the day, they told us we had this project. The beauty of Lincoln, Nebraska is many. It has one of the best buildings in the United States, in the state capital there. If you have not been there, it is a worthy trip just for that building. But the other 2 experiences in which our building is implicated is at the intersection of the Sheldon Museum by Philip Johnson, which is the one up there. Not a great fan of Philip Johnson, but I cross my heart and hope to die that is a fantastic building that you should see, and it has a great collection. And if you've never been to a football game, there are people that drive over 9 hours to join 90,000 other people to be part of that game, and it's quite extraordinary to see it in the life. Our building happens at the intersection of this, and at the intersection of these 2 cultures. I was not brought up in a context to think of football as a cultural thing, but of course it is. And so these 2 communities come together in the arts, as it were, through the School of Architecture, which acts as a kind of platform for fundraising for those events. That is what great fundraising is in the US, sports. We use the link of the existing building to reactivate the base and reactivate a dead auditorium at the base, an exhibition hall, and outdoor porches for installations for the School of Architecture, connecting the 4 wings together around an outdoor classroom. A very simple building, very different than our other buildings, which are made up of 4 systems, basically, a connection to the existing core, a steel system for the junction between the old buildings and the new, a CLT structure, a cal wall skin, and a new entry. Basically, I say it's a 4 detail building. And essentially a new public face for the building, its new front door, and a kind of diaphanous skin that glows at night as one essentially gets prepared for these games. Not unlike Melbourne School of Design, much of this building was prefabricated, and there was no budget for me to do CA. So if I had not timed my visits to the site, I basically would have missed out on the construction of our own building. And so I came once for the erection of the steel structure in the kind of dark gray. I came another time during the construction of the CLT, and another time for the facade. And each of those events took no more than 2 weeks to do, with like lulls in between as they were doing other prefabrications in between them. The whole project took 1.5 years from design to construction. So it's really super fast track. And so with all of the articulation of the building also, it is really a prefab building. Again, the grand promenade of the football games as they're happening, and the importance really of making a dialogue between the identity of the building, its facade, and how it operates urbanistically. Effectively, the shingled facade looks to the east and to the west. On the east is the Sheldon, and on the west is the promenade to the football game. And so part of the idea of the building is that it kind of manifests this annual ritual in a very potent way, while it also looks west ostensibly, and demarcates the events that happen under this porch with kegs and pre-game things like that, and essentially bringing two publics that most often don't come together into dialogue with each other. I would like to think that we're urbanists. The reality is that we're not. For the most part, we're doing installations, we're doing small buildings, we're doing, architecture. But I like to see that, we recenter ourselves amongst a community of people whose values, whose cultures, and whose mentalities form our commitment to a notion of the public, however evolving that public is. Even as we revisit these as just objects, as architectures, even when they're domestic structures like just houses, the notion of a public realm remains forever important to us. And as extraordinary as we may deem a detail of architecture and all of that, it must be in service of some grander public mission. Thank you.